The sea slaps the hull. Timber answers with a long, tired groan. A rope bites a palm slick with salt and blood. A sailor grips it and cannot let go. Inside his mouth the gums weep. A taste of iron fills the air. Below decks, men lie shoulder to shoulder in a dark, hot, cruel space. The smell is sweat, tar and stale biscuit. Water is parcelled like gold. Meat is salt and leather. No fruit moves through the hatch. No green leaves. The calendar says weeks. The bodies change in days. A man wakes tired. He eats his ration. He holds a line and his legs shake. 2 weeks later, he cannot climb the rigging. His joints swell until he cannot bend. His gums bleed when he speaks. Teeth loosen like rotten nails. He cannot stand watch through the long night watches. Another man takes his place and falls the next dawn. The cycle of loss accelerates like a leak below the waterline. The captain stands with his hand on the rail. His face is mapped by salt and cold. He counts heads with a dry professional voice. He counts fewer men every dawn. Each missing body is a hole in the ship's defences. Each lost hand is one less to furl a sail in a rising wind. The ship cannot turn fast anymore. The helmsman is often too sick to grasp the wheel. A storm arrives and the crew moves like frightened children. Sails flap uncontrolled. Ropes tangle. The vessel yawns and answers the sea poorly. Vessels in that era were tight, low and hot below decks. Sailors slept in hammocks strung close to barrels of salted meat and sacks of biscuit. Damp cloth rubbed against skin until sores opened. Lice and rats established permanent colonies. The diet was long on salted protein and hard bread. It was short on anything fresh. The deficiency did not announce itself with a single thunderclap. It crept forward in small betrayals of strength and will. A bleeding gum is a small thing for a land doctor. At sea it is the first sign of collapse. When half the watch cannot climb, the ship cannot trim a sail. When the mast cannot be tended, the ship cannot point into a gale. When the vessel cannot manoeuvre, it becomes prey to weather and enemy alike. A navy commander with 100 men can fight. A captain with 10 fit hands cannot. Voyages that began with flags and fanfare ended in limp, empty decks. The Portuguese pushed farther into the Atlantic at the end of the 15th century. They chased winds and charts no map fully contained. Their ships carried men who would never see home again. Vasco da Gama's first India voyage was one of those journeys that tested the limits of men and provisions. 1497 to 1499. Vasco da Gama. The fleet put out with courage and spice hopes. It returned with empty bunks and stories of sickness. On that voyage, many men died from disease. Scurvy was among the deadliest. Sailors fell in such numbers that ports along Africa's coast became lifelines. Captains made desperate calls into friendly harbours. They traded for fresh provisions when possible. They bribed local rulers with silver to let them come ashore. Sometimes they were refused and sent further down the line of islands and inlets. Every unplanned stop cost time, treasure, and chance. When a captain orders a port call, he makes more than a navigation decision. He chooses politics and diplomacy under strain. A crippled crew invites negotiation or threat. Dozens of voyages required months of patchwork diplomacy just to feed the sick. Other voyages simply folded and turned home. The age of discovery advanced patchily because ships survived only by chance and favour. Scurvy was invisible, but it shaped every movement of the fleet. The medical explanations available during these years did not solve the problem. Doctors blamed everything from bad air to spoiled meat. Some called it bad humours. Others accused witchcraft or poor discipline. The truth was plain to those who watched a man with a bloody mouth fail at the wheel. But the causal chain, the missing nutrient, remained unknown. Captains and surgeons tried cures by habit and hope. Fresh food helped when it was available, but it rarely was. Onboard improvisation became common practice. Crews planted small tubs of peas on deck where weather allowed. They chased rainwater for greens when storms passed. Some ships kept live animals for meat, and the chance at fresh blood and offal. A few captains ordered fruit to be bought at every stop. Those captains saved men. Most voyages did not have such luck. Resupply points were uneven across the oceans. Some coasts were friendly, many were not. The human toll of scurvy is brutal and intimate. Men who once hauled at ropes became collections of sores and shame. Pain in the knee or wrist would shut down the most useful bodies. A ship needs strength at dawn. It needs sharp eyes on the lookout. Scurvy removed these quietly. The watches blurred. Sleep became an opportunistic thing with no guarantee. Between decks, the living lay with the dead. Burial at sea became routine and private. Loss of a few men had exponential consequences. A single damaged sail required 2 or 3 healthy hands to repair it fast. The sick could not move like that. Delays multiplied into days, and then into weeks. News moved slowly across the ocean. A fleet that might be reinforced from another port could find itself alone because men were sick elsewhere. Strategic timing dissolved into improvisation. Empires moved at the tempo set by suffering hands. Weather magnified the problem. A sudden squall that a full crew could weather would terrify a short-handed deck. Storms reached for the weakest ships first. Wrecks happened not always from crashing waves. Sometimes they happened because the crew could not keep the sails set, could not cut away a damaged spar, or could not bail fast enough. The sea filled in the gap that sickness opened. Enemy action preyed upon this weakness too. Naval battles became contests of endurance as much as skill. A ship with men hollowed by scurvy could not reload a swivel gun quickly. They could not climb to board or repel boarding. Skirmishes turned quickly into routs when bodies gave out. Pirates and rival navies took advantage of any obvious weakness. Some strategically important voyages failed because the crew could not fight their way clear. The cost mattered in treasure and time. A delayed fleet could miss a monsoon wind window. Missing that wind meant months more at sea. That extra time increased sickness. More sickness meant more delay. A single misstep echoed through an empire's agenda. The Portuguese crown and other monarchs learned this calculus the hard way. Expeditions that planned for glory found themselves budgeting for sickness. Onboard life had social consequences as well. Hierarchies frayed under the pressure. Officers grew harsher out of desperation. Mutinies flared in extreme cases when men felt abandoned to illness. Discipline shifted from routine to survival. The ship's culture changed from disciplined order to wounded improvisation. These micro-societies adapted with strange, practical rituals that were more about staying alive than about honour. The decisions captains made in these months shaped colonial outcomes. A delayed convoy might fail to grasp a treaty or lose leverage with a coastal prince. A crippled squadron might allow a rival power to claim an island or port. The practical inability to move men and guns meant political concessions without a fight. Scurvy, unseen, made itself heard in treaty councils and trading posts far from the decks where it began. For the men on that leaking caravel, the horizon remained a promise and a threat. They watched each other for small signs of decline. They learned the look of a man about to lose his teeth. They learned to pass food quietly to the sick. They watched captains make hard choices about ports and punishment. They buried one another under lead weights and wrapped in sailcloth. By the time the fleet in the story reached port, many could not recall the reason they set out. Some sailors died within sight of land. Others lived to tell a story of quiet rot. Those stories travelled back to royal courts and to taverns, shaping policy and fear. When a monarch inspected a map, that monarch also inspected the mortality list that arrived with the fleet's captain. The slow catastrophe aboard these ships made the age of discovery precarious. It was not just a matter of ambition and seamanship. It was a medical emergency repeated at sea for centuries. Scurvy was not an incidental hazard. It was an operational crisis. A single missing hand could mean a lost port, a failed trade agreement, or a wrecked flagship. Empires learned slowly that conquest required solving the smallest bodily needs of those who did the work. The final image is small and sharp. A single rope in a single palm. A bleeding gum that signals more than sickness. The crews that pushed the world's horizons outward did so while their own bodies betrayed them. The voyages that survived were those that managed to find green food, fresh water, or mercy from a harbour. The voyages that failed collapsed under a quiet, gruesome arithmetic. This is what Scurvy did, over and over, on the ropes and in the hammocks. It turned skill and courage into slow attrition. It forced captains into ports they would not have chosen. It reshaped the map by attrition rather than by battle. And it hung in the background of every chart made and every flag raised in those dangerous years at sea. Bleeding gums, loosened teeth, and a wasting of the limbs. An ancient physician set those words down in ink several centuries before Christ. The script curls across a brittle page like a bloodstain on paper. A slow hand drew the symptom and its cure beside one another. The cure was simple in words. Eat fresh greens, drink sour fruits, make broths from meat and herbs. Classical medical writers described the same illness again and again. They named the signs plainly. They urged fresh food as the remedy. Hippocratic texts spoke of wasting with bleeding gums. Pliny recorded sailors weakened by a rottenness of the mouth and gums. Galen catalogued the complaint and recommended restorative diets. Dioscorides mentioned sour fruits and aromatics as medicines. Pliny the Elder. These were not idle observations. They came from a civilization that sailed widely and campaigned often. Armies on long marches suffered exactly the same symptoms. Sailors on Mediterranean crossings suffered them too. The remedy in the books matched the cause. Fresh plant food supplied what preserved meats did not. Vitamin C, unknown then, lived in leaves and fruits. Ancient physicians saw the pattern between decay and diet. And yet, knowing did not equal doing. Books sat in libraries. Ships sailed. The rope and salt of a seagoing world separated prescription from practice. The Roman state could resupply fleets near home. It could call ports and markets into service. It could also feed armies close to the sea. Then the world changed. Emperors fell. Trade routes shifted inland and north. Monasteries became the main copyists of medicine. Books survived in cellars and cloisters, not on decks. Sailors rarely carried Galen's weighty volumes. A mariner learned by taste and by chief mate's rules. That oral practice altered remedies. 476. The collapse of Roman administrative networks mattered for medicine. It mattered more for provisioning ships. Local economies favoured salt and smoke over fresh greens. Salt-cured fish and pork became staple ship stores. Salt preserved calories, but not the unseen nutrients. Men ate well enough to keep going, but they lacked the small molecules that stopped rot. Knowledge passed through other hands. Arabic physicians translated and preserved many classical works. Byzantine doctors copied remedies into compendia. European scholars later rediscovered those manuscripts. Yet the men who set sail did not read these translations. Sea captains read charts and ledgers, not medical treatises. The gulf between scholar and sailor widened. Practical remedies continued in pockets. Coastal fishermen and islanders kept local tricks. Pickled cabbage in northern ports offered a cheap source of vitamin C. Fermented foods preserved nutrients in ways salt did not destroy. Norse and Baltic communities used such foods before long ocean crossings. Those traditions helped some crews survive, but they were local and inconsistent. Trade and taste also shaped what ships carried. Fresh citrus slowly entered Mediterranean markets. Citrus trees grew in warm, well-fed gardens. They did not flourish in northern European orchards for centuries. Lemons and limes remained exotic and expensive for most seafaring nations. A captain on a multi-month Atlantic voyage could not count on citrus. Even when available, sailors often disliked its sourness. Commanders preferred preserved stores that kept longer and satisfied more men. Writers of the later medieval period recognised the disease. They called it by various names. Scorbutus became the Latinised label in medical lists. English speakers used scurf and later scurvy. The language tracked the problem, but labels did not build supply chains. Practical obstacles defeated theoretical knowledge on deck. How to keep greens from rotting in a hold. How to convince a crew to eat acidic juices that spoiled barrels and cut wood. How to budget for perishable stores on lengthy exploratory voyages. Most captains could not answer these questions. Logistics, not ignorance, often decided life or death. Sometimes the remedy flickered back into view. A captain at anchor could gather fresh herbs and greens from a friendly shore. A fleet could resupply at a port and restore its men. Where stopping was possible, scurvy could be reversed. Where it was not, the disease took hold and multiplied. A ship might lose half its hands in months without fresh food. Loss of crew meant loss of manoeuvre, of speed, and sometimes of the ship itself. The Roman remedy therefore existed like a tool without a craftsman. The knowledge was clear enough in a study. It was not planted into maritime practice. That failure was not an accident. It was the geometry of institutions and incentives. Governments prioritised cargo and coin. Long voyages promised profit or empire. Short-term provisioning maximised immediate gains. Preventive diets cost more and required foresight. When the 15th century opened a new Atlantic world, this fragile knowledge gap mattered. Ships left sight of land longer than ever before. Voyages lasted weeks and months beyond old patterns. That length multiplied the disease's reach. Scurvy became the slow hurricane that no sail could outrun. There were cultural losses too. Surgical knowledge advanced in cities and courts. Naval routine advanced elsewhere. The two spheres rarely overlapped. Physicians debated humours while sailors counted ration tins. Medicine remained a learned discipline, not a naval one. The irony is sharp. The cure was not mystical. It was ordinary food, common and often cheap. A diet of citrus, greens and fresh meat prevented the wasting disease. Ancient physicians had written that plainly, yet centuries of social change hid that plainness from the decks of ships. This chapter's tragedy is not only the sickness, it is the way human institutions forget what they once knew. Pages in a monastery showed a cure. Salt in a barrel denied it. A captain's ledger prioritised profit over prevention. A sailor's dislike of sourness exacerbated the problem. Small choices multiplied into catastrophe. A handful of men might die on one voyage. Entire expeditions faced collapse on another. Empires risked losing ships full of men and treasure. The stakes of lost institutional memory were imperial in scale. Yet the record also offers hope. Where old remedies survived in practice, they worked. Where local communities kept fermented or sour foods, crews fared better. Where commanders listened to physicians, recovery followed. This patchwork of memory kept the idea of a cure from vanishing completely. The next chapters tell how that patchwork finally grew threads. They tell of experiments, of stubborn captains, and of shifting policy. But this chapter closes on the simple, mournful fact. Human observation outlived consistent application for centuries. People saw scurvy. People prescribed fresh food. The prescription rarely reached the place that needed it most, the ship at sea. A map slid into view, blue lines cutting the oceans like stitched arteries. Routes radiated from Lisbon and Seville into seas no European chart had trusted. Christopher Columbus steered west and found islands in the Caribbean that tasted like salvation. Vasco da Gama hugged Africa's coast to reach India's spice markets and distant wealth. Ferdinand Magellan pushed around South America seeking a western highway to the Indies. Those trajectories tore men from land for months and sometimes for years at a time. Ships carried salted meat, dried legumes, and hard biscuits that lasted longer than hope. Fresh fruit arrived only when wind and luck steered a hull to shore. Cooks boiled and salted everything until essential nutrients dissolved into the brine. The loss of fresh provisions was invisible, but the bodies noticed immediately and painfully. At first, the change felt like ordinary fatigue in hands and backs. Sailors climbed the rigging more slowly and took longer to tie their knots. Simple tasks became fights for breath, balance, and the memory of strength. Muscles a man once trusted failed under loads that had been routine. A man who had hauled ropes might now lie mute in his hammock. That same man lost appetite for salted meat and biscuit by the second week. His gums began to throb and bleed with every swallowed mouthful. Teeth loosened as sockets filled with dark, clotted blood and slow pain. A mouth of clotted blood, a jaw slack, a life declining. You would watch a teammate spit out a tooth like a small white pebble. Wounds refused to close. Every scrape festered into an angry sore that no salve steadied. Bruises bloomed under skin like blue maps of accumulated damage. Men who could not move lay in hammocks and watched their mates die. A deck without hands is a ship stripped of its means to steer and fight. Sails could not be trimmed quickly when storms tested a weakened crew. Bilges went unpumped, and rot took hold of timbers already sodden and tired. Cannons could not be hauled into firing position without steady men on deck. Disease and scurvy cut crews down far faster than enemy cannon fire. Ships limped home without prisoners to interrogate or labour to maintain hulls. Captains faced a brutal calculus every dawn as the muster rolled forward. Pursue the mission and risk losing ship and men to storm or mutiny. Turn back and admit failure to patrons, investors, and an unforgiving crown. Stop at a strange port and hope that locals would barter for provisions. That port might be friendly, it might be hostile. In 1521, Magellan sought alliance in island waters and died in battle. Ferdinand Magellan, left in 1519, returned in 1522. 5 ships set sail. 1 ship came home, 270 men embarked, 18 men returned. Many died of scurvy and hunger on that long, unforgiving route. The Pacific crossing stripped crews of almost every last meal of fresh food. For weeks they chewed stale biscuits and collected rainwater in barrels. Men ate leather, salted hides, and whatever the rats could not find. When fruit finally appeared on a distant beach, whole crews revived in days. Those swift recoveries hinted at a remedy even when no sailor understood the reason. Every stop became a negotiation for survival as much as trade. Fresh fruit, goats, or milk were treated like coin among captains and chiefs. European commanders bartered cloth, metal, and promises for food and water. Sometimes locals gave freely, sometimes they withheld and drove ships away. If a voyage missed a provisioning point, the entire mission endangered itself. A single missed stop could force a fleet to turn home, abandoning objectives. Mutiny grew from hunger and the slow corrosion of morale aboard ship. Men who once obeyed orders came to steal provisions and hide what they found. Some captains executed ringleaders to preserve discipline, worsening fear and grief. Others tightened rations until sailors wasted away from deliberate starvation. Survivors later remembered the stench of decaying flesh and the rasp of dying breath. Back in Europe, investors tallied ships, men, and the cargo that finally returned. When crews evaporated, routes grew uncertain, and the pace of discovery slowed. Governments hesitated to claim territory that no healthy garrison could hold. A single bad season at sea could redraw imperial ambitions on an atlas. By the second month at sea, sores and bleeding gums signalled a deeper crisis. By the third month, coordination failed, and even simple knots became impossible. The ship's surgeon could cut teeth or lance boils, but not cure the underlying lack. Surgeons prescribed fresh air, purgatives, and bleeding because humoral theory demanded action. Those remedies rarely stopped the steady march of weakness and internal collapse. At times, captains punished suspected slackness, confusing disease with cowardice. Punishment sometimes killed the sick outright or pushed the living toward open revolt. Starvation walked hand in hand with scurvy on many long voyages. When a man had no reserves, his body could not resist infection at all. Wounds that once healed slowly turned into gangrene and irresistible illnesses. A rope burn became a death sentence when immune defences collapsed. Morning muster became a roll call of the absent and the listless. Fewer hands meant watches went unfilled and navigation suffered at night. Mistakes multiplied, courses wandered, and voyages lengthened in a self-feeding spiral. Longer voyages invited more disease. A vicious circle tightened around wooden hulls. Investors who bankrolled these voyages expected cargoes to cover debts and fund fleets. When crews died, ships returned lighter, and creditors demanded compensation for losses. The cost of a failed expedition could bankrupt a noble house or a merchant syndicate. That financial risk raised the bar for future funding and narrowed who could explore. When the Victoria finally limped back to Spain, the story spread quickly. The cargo of spice dazzled financiers while the faces of survivors haunted courtiers. Officials counted profits, then counted the empty bunks and the names scratched in ledgers. Spice paid the voyage's debts. It did not return sons and brothers to families. Luck and geography often decided whether a voyage succeeded or came apart. Riding close to coasts allowed stops for shellfish and greens that warded off scurvy. But hugging shorelines exposed ships to reefs, coastal batteries, and treacherous currents. Commanders balanced those risks daily as men slipped from the master roles. Scurvy carried shame aboard ship as much as pains and sores. Sailors feared being labelled cowardly or lazy if they fell ill in front of mates. Shame made men hide symptoms, delay help, and spread contagion silently to others. That secrecy cost lives and complicated every captain's fight to preserve discipline. When explorers tried to plant settlements, scurvy devastated small garrisons within months. A fort with no healthy men could not hold a harbour or secure supply lines. Consequently, empire advanced in fits and starts wherever food security allowed permanence. Staging islands and harbours gained strategic value because they supplied more than water. Possession of such stations proved as important as control of a good harbour or defence. Navies began to mark provisioning points in their atlases as lifelines, not luxuries. Staging ports like Madeira, the Azores, and remote Atlantic islands rose to prominence. Possessing these islands meant fleets could reach further and plan with a measure of safety. In effect, scurvy turned geography into a strategy for empire and trade. Yet cause and cure remained obscure to many commanders for generations. Wrong theories led to wrong practices, and men continued to die needlessly at sea. Every explorer's map hid a ledger of lost lives scribbled in its margins. The triumphs of navigation were paid for by bodies wasted for want of fresh fruit. Maps expanded, but the human cost made those expansions fragile and slow to consolidate. Only when sailors learned prevention could exploration be planned with predictable success. That lesson arrived slowly and often came after the loss of too many lives. Scurvy amputated manpower and the will to sail further from known shores. It turned victories into fragile ruins and exploration into a gamble with human lives. The age of discovery widened horizons, but it did so on bleeding, hungry backs. When prevention finally took hold, the world grew steadier under sail and compass. Until then, every voyage at the edge paid its price in men and in delay. Case note: Patient Thomas Roper, seaman, age 32. Symptoms: swollen gums, spontaneous bleeding, loose teeth, foul breath, appetite failing, limbs weak, ulcers forming on the legs. Diagnosis: putrid scurvy. Prognosis: doubtful. Treatment prescribed: bleeding, repeated purging with calomel, blistering plasters. Cordials administered, spiced with ginger and pepper. Wine taken in small quantities. Surgeon's final remark: remedy doubtful, cause uncertain, patient declines. That note reads like a confession of ignorance. It also reads like, authority. The surgeon knew the work of Galen and Hippocrates. He practiced within a medical language 2,000 years old. Those names were not footnotes, they were law. Humoral theory was the dominant actor in the sick bay. It explained disease's imbalance among 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Every symptom became a sign of excess or deficiency. Swellings meant cold and moist humours had taken hold. Bleeding therefore made sense. It removed excess blood. Purgatives followed. They emptied the bowels of imagined corruption. Warming cordials sought to correct the cold temperament in failing bodies. Those interventions fit a coherent internal logic. They also fit the tools doctors already owned. Another actor strode onto the deck. The idea of putrefaction. Physicians called scurvy a kind of inward rotting. If meat rotted, they reasoned, the body might similarly rot. So they reached for what prevented rot on board. Spices, vinegar and distilled spirits were thought to stop putrefaction. If spice kept meat from smelling bad, it might keep the blood from smelling bad. Spiced cordials became a medical staple on long voyages. Ship cooks and surgeons used pepper as prevention, not just flavour. Miasma theory held its place beside humoral and putrefaction thought. Disease rose from foul air and polluted atmospheres, doctors argued. Clean air, ventilation, and fumigation were prescribed remedies. Captains were told to clear the hold and burn brimstone if necessary. Men were kept on deck in an attempt to face the air's purifying breath. Those measures did improve some conditions linked to filth and overcrowding. They did almost nothing for what scurvy actually was. The logic appeared sensible to educated men ashore and afloat. Spices chased stench. Brandy warmed the weak. Bleeding removed corruption. These were active remedies, visible and dramatic. They let physicians do something. That doing reassured captains and admirals. It comforted families on shore. But it also had a darker side. Purgatives and bleeding weakened already depleted bodies. They stripped men of fluids and appetite and strength. Calomel, mercury-based, induced harsh diarrhea and further debility. Alcohol sipped as a restorative impaired digestion and judgment. Spices masked hunger without replacing essential food. Those practices turned plausible medicine into active harm. The misclassification of scurvy as contagious or putrefactive created other consequences. When a sickness is thought contagious, the first instinct is quarantine. Ships and crews were sometimes denied entry to ports. Men were kept aboard sick and isolated from markets of fresh food. A disease thought to be miasmatic demanded fumigation rather than supply reform. Officials invested in disinfecting holds rather than changing victualling policy. This diverted attention away from a dietary cause that no one had yet named. Medical books reinforced the mistake. Textbooks listed symptoms, recommended the lancet and the purge. They praised cordials, preserved meats and warming regimens. They gave little attention to fresh vegetables, which were logistically awkward. Authority reproduced itself. What was written became what was done. Practical shipboard constraints amplified theoretical error. Victualling relied on salted meat, dried peas, and shipboard beer. Those provisions kept sailors alive for months but lacked fresh acids and greens. Ship captains preferred food that would not spoil at sea. Doctors told captains to trust long-preserved provisions and spicing. So provisioning and practice became mutually reinforcing. A handful of observers did notice patterns that textbooks missed. They saw that men who ate citrus fared better. They saw scurvy diminish near ports where fresh fruit was cheap. Those accounts circulated, but they rarely reshaped medical doctrine. Authority and habit proved stronger than scattered empirical notes. Commercial interests also shaped medical choices. The spice trade was vast and profitable. It offered a ready substitute to fresh produce. Spices were an elite commodity made portable by merchants. They fit the supply chain of empire far better than fresh lemons. So a medical solution that appealed to existing trade remained attractive. The intellectual framework also created perverse incentives for patent medicines. Entrepreneurs sold cordials that promised to halt putrefaction. They advertised heating, warming, aromatic blends for the rotting sailor. Captains bought them because the bills read like cures. Those purchases further delayed structural change in provisioning. Institutional inertia entrenched the error. Naval boards and hospital administrators trusted established practitioners. Changing supply lists meant confronting logistics, contracts, and budgets. It also meant admitting centuries of error. That admission rarely came quickly. All of this had an unmistakable human cost. Men wasted slowly, days blurring into months of weakness. Gums bled to putrid stumps. Teeth fell away. Wounds failed to heal. The ship's routine continued around them, the pumps and sails indifferent. Few of the treatments addressed the underlying deficiency. Deaths accumulated. For captains, the choice felt urgent and immediate. Should they blister a sick man, or head for the nearest fruiting shore? Medical authority pushed toward active remedies. Logistics pushed toward the familiar. Many captains chose what felt like action. The action often failed. The story becomes clearer when the medical ideas are treated as actors. Humoral theory sent surgeons to the lancet. Putrefaction theory sent cooks to the spice chest. Miasma theory sent sailors up on deck and officers to burn brimstone. Contagion thinking locked men out of ports and markets. Each theory altered decisions, supplies, and behaviour. Each theory changed who lived and who died. This is why a correct remedy remained invisible for so long. No single doctor proposed a theory that connected diet to scurvy. The concept of an essential nutrient did not exist in the medical language. Without that concept, fresh citrus was anecdote, not mechanism. An occasional success could be waved away as coincidence or luck. Confidence in the wrong frameworks prolonged the crisis. Well-meaning men acted within their best knowledge and instruments. Their confidence made those treatments hard to dislodge. Centuries of plausible practices multiplied the human toll. The final irony is plain and bitter. Scurvy was not some exotic infection. It was absence. Absence of a small, simple molecule in the daily food of sailors. But until someone built a scientific language that named that absence, the cure hid. That is why the surgeon's ledger reads as it does. The note is clinical, authoritative, and unsure. It shows the limits of a system that could not see its own blind spot. It reveals how theories shaped choices that sent men to their graves. Faulty frameworks did more than misdiagnose. They made the right remedy invisible. They prolonged an epidemic that empire could not afford. They kept captains fighting symptoms rather than fixing supply. And for generations they turned plausible intervention into tragedy. A medicine chest clinked on the deck of HMS Salisbury. An 18th century naval surgeon closed it and spoke with brisk authority. He announced a trial to test cures for the ship's scourge. 12 men lay pale and bleeding on rough planks around him. Their mouths wept blood. Their teeth loosened. Their limbs failed them. Scurvy had already written a long ledger of death across the world's oceans. Captains watched crews shrink into shadows, useless where strength was needed most. Surgeons patched and prodded and argued, while whole expeditions teetered on collapse. On most ships, remedies arrived as custom and hope rather than careful measurement. James Lind chose a different path. He chose comparison. He selected 12 sailors who suffered similar scurvy symptoms and weakness. He grouped them into 6 pairs so each pair looked much the same. Each pair received a different treatment while everything else stayed constant. The men lived in the same ward, ate the same rations, and worked the same watch. Only the assigned remedy differed between the pairs. One pair received a quart of cider every day. Another pair took an acid cordial called elixir of vitriol. Another pair was given small spoonfuls of vinegar several times daily. One pair received 2 oranges and a lemon each day. The remaining pairs tried other common shipboard cures of the age. Lynn watched closely and wrote everything down. He recorded appetite, sleep, strength, bleeding gums, and the closing of sores. He watched for time until recovery, or time until no improvement occurred. He recorded each man's state day by day in a neat, practical ledger. He did not accept stories. He preferred numbers and comparable outcomes. The responses were stark and immediate. The cider and vinegar groups showed little to no meaningful recovery. The elixir of vitriol relieved nothing measurable in the cases tested. The men given citrus, however, improved rapidly and visibly. Within days they ate with appetite, stood without fainting, and slept calmly. 1747. James Lind. One sailor Lind later noted became fit for duty within 6 days. Another rose from the sick berth and walked the deck without weakness. Their gums stopped bleeding. Their sores began to close. Other men on the same ship remained weak and miserable during that time. Lind framed the finding as clear and practical rather than mystical. He argued that oranges and lemons were anti-scorbutic, countering scurvy's effects. He also emphasized method. Compare treatments under identical conditions to learn what works. He turned observation into an experiment. He turned experience into evidence. He published those observations as a treatise of the scurvy in 1753. The book laid out case histories, tables, and straightforward recommendations for sailors. Lind recommended the regular use of citrus for both cure and prevention. He also urged naval officers to note outcomes rather than rely on tradition alone. Those pages read like a ledger of survival. They also read like a demand to act. Yet action did not follow immediately. The Admiralty and many ship captains hesitated. The reasons were practical, political and cultural. Fresh fruit spoiled quickly on long voyages and supply was uncertain. Victualling officers complained about cost and logistics when provisioning hundreds of men. Many physicians clung to older theories of humours, putrefaction and rotting juices. A trial on one ship did not overturn centuries of medical habit overnight. So Lind's evidence sat in ink while sailors continued to die at sea. Letters passed between surgeons, captains and ministers with repeated frustration. Some captains tried Lind's recommendation and saved crews. Others dismissed it as anomaly. Institutional change moved slower than medicine's small laboratories aboard wooden ships. Still, Lind's trial mattered in ways that history recognizes more clearly now. It showed that a controlled comparison could expose a real effect. It offered a simple template. Keep conditions constant. Vary only the treatment. Observe results. That method would become central to clinical science generations later. In a cramped sick bay, Lind had sketched the shape of evidence-based medicine. He did not and could not explain the chemistry behind the cure. No one in his time understood the nutrient we now call vitamin C. Lind described outcomes, not molecules. He recommended lemons and oranges because they worked. That practical truth proved sufficient for the wounded men on his deck. The social lesson proved more stubborn. Discovery does not automatically remake policy. Proof on a page does not always match the stubbornness of supply chains. Good science still depends on good logistics and courageous administrators. The experiment condensed compassion and calculation into a single, decisive act. It made a ledger of human bodies, and then turned that ledger into advice. It exposed the cruel gap between knowing and doing. Lind handed the Navy a solution. The Navy took decades to accept it fully. The trial also changed how practitioners thought about evidence. Surgeons began to value comparison over anecdote and records over rumour. Young physicians read Lind and began to ask how treatments might be tested. That shift was small at first, then larger, and eventually foundational to modern trials. On the deck of HMS Salisbury, men rose because a single regimen proved superior. Their recovery was plain and repeatable, and that plainness demanded attention. Lind's careful notes created a bridge from suffering to solution, but the bridge required engineers with authority, funds and supply lines to finish it. This chapter of scurvy's history ends with proof and with frustration. It ends with a method planted plainly in the earth of medicine. It ends also with the reminder that good ideas need institutions to carry them forward. Lind had demonstrated how to find a cure. He had not forced its adoption. The next stage would test whether Empire could learn from experiment. That test would decide whether fleets would sail with strength or with hollowed crews. For now, the sick bay ledger lay open, the medicines noted, and the lesson recorded. The cure existed within reach. The rest was a matter of will and work. The mahogany council table creaked under maps and ledgers as men in powdered wigs argued in low voices. A candle guttered beside a stack of medical reports and a small, stubborn bottle of lemon juice. Inside the Admiralty, the problem of scurvy had become a question of pennies, pride, and empire. James Lind had published his controlled experiment in 1753. He had shown citrus could cure scurvy. That fact existed in print for 40 years before it mattered in practice. Policy, not knowledge, proved the slowest enemy of the sea. Sir Gilbert Blane walked into these debates with a different temperament than the old-school captains. He was a physician who read statistical reports like battle plans. He gathered surgeons' journals, ship returns and eyewitness accounts. He turned scattered cases into patterns a bureaucrat could not ignore. Blane began his campaign in the early 1780s and never stopped. He wrote letters. He published recommendations. He leaned on ministers. He translated medicine into administration. The Admiralty met in stages. A committee reviewed a surgeon's note. Another secretary examined provision accounts. A clerk tabulated costs. A flag officer calculated risks to blockades and convoys. Each man kept a different ledger and a different concern. The surgeon wanted health. The treasurer wanted savings. The captain feared disorder among his crew. The minister feared the electorate and the purse. Resistance fell into predictable categories. Some senior officers distrusted new medical theories. They clung to purging, bleeding, and familiar tonics. Others argued logistics would defeat any cure. How to supply fresh citrus to ships months at sea, they asked. Could a fleet rely on sour lemons from distant docks? The Treasury asked the simple, fatal question of many reforms. What will this cost? Cost and risk stalled action more effectively than any scientific rebuttal. Blane methodically answered each objection. He showed that soured thinking cost more than lemon juice did. He produced case after case where ships crippled by scurvy missed seasons of trade and battle. He calculated the manpower lost to disease. He compared those losses to the modest price of citrus. He made the numbers tell the story the toes and gums already had. Momentum crept forward in tiny bureaucratic steps. Orders circulated as proposals. Surgeons were instructed to try lemon juice provisionally. Captains reported mixed results back to the Admiralty. Some captains obeyed, some did not. The experimentation phase created uneven islands of success within the fleet. The decisive turn arrived during a great strategic strain. War pressed the Navy to keep ships at sea longer. Blockades demanded endurance and crews in fighting condition. The Admiralty could no longer accept voyages shredded by preventable disease. The calculus of risk shifted toward prevention. Prevention now looked cheaper than the cost of losing a ship or a campaign. In 1795, the Admiralty issued a formal order for citrus to be provided to ships. That order would change naval medicine forever. 18 words mark the end of decades of delay. The order required lemon juice to be issued regularly to all sailors. The phrase landed like a stamped seal on years of argument. Men in offices finally turned abstract medical literature into real, daily rations. Sir Gilbert Blane had pushed for this moment for years. His face appears on the paper of policy like a quiet, steady hand. He had argued not only about cures, but about how to make a cure a habit. He fought for supply lines and standardized measures. He insisted on official orders rather than ad hoc recommendations. He understood how an empire functions. An empire needs rules more than it needs novel wisdom. The first years after the order revealed the gap between law and practice. Supply systems were still crude. Citrus arrived in barrels, often diluted, sometimes spoiled. Some captains mixed juice with spirits to mask its taste. Some officers stored it under poor conditions. Old habits and weak logistics blunted some benefits. Still, the trend was unmistakable. Surgeons' logs began to fill with a new kind of entry. Lines noting gangrenous gums vanished. Entries began to read like reports from a healthier fleet. Sailors who once collapsed by the dozen on deck now worked shifts and fought. Squadrons could maintain blockades longer. Convoys crossed thinned waters without hemorrhaging crews. The strategic consequences were immediate and concrete. A navy less ravaged by disease could enforce blockades. That enforcement strained enemy supplies. It allowed Britain to project power far from home. Operational readiness improved. Admiralty planners could assign ships to longer missions with confidence. Those missions shaped the naval wars of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The story of this policy shift is not a tidy victory. Implementation remained messy for years. Officers argued over rations. Commodities managers sought the cheapest citrus available. Cheap often meant poor vitamin content. That problem would haunt supply officers for decades. Yet the moral is clear. Policy amplified medical insight into practical advantage. Institutional change required mundane instruments. An order on paper mattered because clerks filed it, because pursers' accounts recorded it, because captains were inspected on adherence, because ship surgeons were given authority to enforce it. Those small, routine acts turned private experiments into a fleet-wide reform. This chapter of the story shows how slow institutions can be to accept obvious truths. It also shows how they can correct course when survival and strategy demand it. Lind provided the science. Blaine and others translated that evidence into policy. The Admiralty turned the policy into practice, and the Navy turned practice into military advantage. The delay between experiment and adoption was not merely medical arrogance. It was bureaucracy, economics, and the friction of supply. It was also a world in which new knowledge had to pass through many hands. Each hand could slow or redirect the flow. The British Admiralty did not leap. It negotiated. It weighed. It finally signed. For sailors, the consequence was personal and immediate. Men who once expected scurvy as an inevitable companion now looked to mess decks and ration rolls. Lemon juice did not cure every illness, but it stopped a slow death that had already thinned navies and empires. That change kept ships at sea and men alive. It altered campaigns. It rewrote strategic possibilities. The lesson of this institutional turn is brutal and precise. Evidence alone rarely moves empires. Evidence must be translated into policy, supply, and habit. That translation required figures like Gilbert Blaine and meetings in mahogany rooms. It required an admiralty willing to change provisioning across a global navy. When that happened, scurvy receded from the list of accepted disasters. The Admiralty's Lemon Order did not end the story. It began a century of incremental improvements in naval health. It also taught administrators what a single medical reform could accomplish. That lesson would matter again and again in campaigns and colonies. Policy became an instrument of survival. And so, a small bottle on a council table came to represent more than an odd taste. It represented a choice made by ministers and clerks. It represented a moment when an empire decided to fight disease with policy. The sea had always demanded courage. It learned, at last, to demand organisation as well. The cooper's hammer sounded like an order. Oak hoops bit wood, and barrels rolled toward the wharf. Crates of citrus arrived next. Pale yellow lemons and deep green limes, smelling of sun and sour. For a brief moment there was hope in the dockyard air. That hope travelled a long and fragile path. Oranges and lemons moved from market to merchant. Merchants sold to suppliers. Suppliers handed stock to victualling yards. Victualling clerks signed invoices and loaded casks onto lighters. Each handoff added time, cost and risk. The Admiralty issued the order. In 1795 the Navy adopted citrus juice for seamen. The decision followed decades of pleading from ship surgeons and reformers. James Linn's experiment had lit the match in 1747. Implementation was supposed to put scurvy behind the fleet. But policy lived on paper. The reality lived in barrels. The first error was substitution. Lemons were scarce, expensive, and seasonal. West Indian limes were cheaper and closer to naval supply lines. The Navy began taking what the Empire could supply. Limes replaced lemons in many stores and on many rations. That substitution mattered. Limes simply held less of what mattered. Measured by modern standards, limes contain less vitamin C than lemons. The difference was not vast by taste. The difference mattered when stores were stretched thin and sailors received less juice. Processing wrecked more of the cure. Vendors boiled juice to concentrate it. They reduced spoilage by turning juice into syrup. Heat killed flavour. Heat also destroyed the anti-scorbutic factor. What the men drank was often only memory of lemon. Storage made the loss worse. Juice sat in casks for months. Wooden barrels breathed. Metal linings and prolonged exposure to air accelerated chemical decay. Oxidation, light, and heat all ate away at the active component. By the time a cask reached a ship, the juice was often a pale trace of its former potency. Fraud and economizing finished the job. Suppliers diluted juice with water. Some merchants mixed in cheap fermented brews and sold them as concentrate. Others substituted other sour liquids. Inspection was irregular. Contract inspectors were overworked and underpaid. Bad cargoes sometimes passed unquestioned. On board, logistics broke down again. The purser held stores and controlled distribution. Pursers often sold parts of new supplies to brokers ashore. Sailors traded rations for rum and cash. The allotted daily measure of citrus could vanish into taverns before reaching the mess table. Even when juice reached a ship intact, dosing was inconsistent. Surgeons recommended different amounts. Captains rationed according to taste or superstition. Some men received a spoonful. Others received a glass. Consistency mattered. Medicine administered in fits and starts could not cure what starvation had taken. The Victualling Board was a bureaucracy stretched by empire. It balanced contracts, colonial politics, and the Navy's appetite for cheap provisions. Cheap limes from the Caribbean solved a procurement problem. Cheap limes also solved a medical problem only imperfectly. The board favoured volume and reliability over freshness. The result was predictable. Admiralty records show the strain. Ship surgeons wrote home with the same complaint across decades. Juice arrived sour, spiritless, and useless, read one recurring report. The language varied, but the meaning did not. Men kept getting sick despite orders. Commanders demanded better stores. The board replied with more contracts and more casks. A defining decision arrived one cold morning in the victualling yard. The Navy favoured West Indian supply chains. The decision was practical and fiscal. It was also decisive for scurvy's fate. It changed everything. It made the cure affordable. It turned prevention into a commodity. It also reduced effectiveness. Another defining moment was quieter. It happened over kettles and sugar kettles and in merchant warehouses. Juice was boiled to concentrate it. It was bottled in tins and casks. Then illness returned aboard long voyages. Boiling destroyed the thing they were trying to save. The miracle identified by Lind succumbed to commerce and preservation. The men paid the price. Fermentation added insult to injury. Poorly stored juice fermented into alcohol or vinegar. Fermentation altered taste and chemistry. Fermented stores could comfort the throat but not mend the gums. Sailors drank a different product and still bled at the gums. The Empire's climate worked against freshness. Tropical heat arrived in waves of humidity. Ships waited for cargoes in sugar ports. The clock began the moment fruit was picked. 2 weeks of heat and jostling could halve an item's anti-scorbutic strength. Months at sea could erase it. Not all losses were chemical. Human error and choice mattered. Captains sometimes saw fresh produce as an indulgence. They preferred salted meat and hardtack for discipline. A few captains guarded citrus. Many did not. Those who did often saved their crews. Supply chain failures also crossed social lines. Plantation owners in the Caribbean optimized for profit. Their limes were plentiful and cheap. They were not selected for vitamin content. The colonial economy favoured size, skin thickness, and ship readiness. Nutritional value took a back seat. Medical men protested. They wrote manuals for preserving juice without boiling. They suggested cold storage, immediate squeezing, and issuing fresh fruit whenever possible. Those recommendations required money and infrastructure. The Admiralty gave only partial answers. Commanders improvised. Some sent small boats ashore to buy fresh lemons at every port of call. Others grew sprouted wheat and carried barrels of sauerkraut. The ingenuity of captains and surgeons saved voyages when official supply chains failed. Yet the damage lingered. On long Pacific crossings, scurvy did not vanish. On distant stations, outbreaks still emptied decks. Sickness delayed assaults and forced retreats. Lives were exchanged for bureaucratic convenience. The nickname Limey gives the decision a human face. It dramatizes the Admiralty's choice. It reduces a complex supply policy to a single flavour. The nickname obscures less flattering truths. It masks the trade-offs that cost lives. The core lesson is practical and brutal. A cure is only as strong as the path that brings it to a patient. Policy without logistics is a promise that cannot be kept. Paper orders cannot stop chemical decay. Contracts cannot prevent theft. Cheap supply cannot substitute for potency. That lesson forced change, slowly and unevenly. Inspectors improved. Contracts tightened. Some stores were moved to cooler cellars. Surgeons and captains kept pushing for fresh fruit at ports. Practical solutions proliferated under pressure. Real change required more than adjustments. It demanded knowledge of chemistry and of storage. It required that the Admiralty treat citrus as medicine, not as condiment. That conceptual shift began to take hold over decades. Until that shift completed, victory was partial. Sailors still suffered. Whole expeditions still teetered. The sight of men dying from a known preventable disease continued to haunt officers and politicians. The moral cost accumulated in fleet logs and family letters. The supply chain looked like a villain. It was also an institution with priorities and limits. Cost, imperial politics, and storage realities shaped decisions. Those decisions produced outcomes that no amount of steadfast goodwill could fully fix. By the time the Navy learned to guard freshness, the language of prevention had changed. New practices spread. But even then, the relief felt by one ship did not guarantee the same for another. Luck, leadership, and local markets still mattered. Logistics kept scurvy alive long after a cure had been discovered. It turned medical insight into a campaign of trial and error. It taught navies that prevention could not be commanded on paper. It required engineering, contracts, discipline, and money in the docks. The men who hammered the barrels heard none of that theory. They felt only the weight of loss and the occasional relief of fresh citrus. Their lives mapped the gap between an abstract cure and a cracked barrel at the wharf. In the end, the story of limes and lemons is the story of modern logistics. It shows how medicine depends on transport, storage, and supply. It shows how empire shaped what sailors ate. It shows how, for decades, the simple promise to prevent scurvy stumbled on the mundane realities of making and moving food. The cure had been found. The cure still had to be delivered. For many years, delivery failed as often as it succeeded. The cost was measured in teeth, and in men gone from decks to graves. The ledger of victory carried those sums long after the last cask was finally sealed correctly. Barrels of sauerkraut sat stacked against the galley's wooden bulkhead, their brine softly hissing. A steward wiped a pewter cup and made a neat entry in the daily inspection book. An officer praised the cleanliness and noted which hammocks needed airing tomorrow. Below decks, the smell of salt, tallow, and ferment lay quietly with the men. These were ordinary scenes aboard extraordinary ships during James Cook's Pacific voyages. Cook sailed 3 major voyages between 1768 and 1779. His ships bore names that would become famous: Endeavour, Resolution, Discovery. He sought stars, maps, scientific specimens and new lands. He also faced the same killer that had felled many earlier captains, scurvy. Cook returned from these long voyages with almost no deaths from scurvy. That outcome astonished other mariners who expected bloody wreckage and empty hammocks. Nothing mystical explained his success. The victory came from routines, provisions, and relentless shipboard management. Daily inspections became law aboard Cook's ships. Officers recorded the state of every locker, crate, and hammock. Crewmen had to wash garments, air bedding, and stand for regular scrubbings of the deck. Ventilation was enforced, not left to chance. Open ports, smoked ropes, and loose planks changed the ship's internal climate. Cleanliness did not cure scurvy by itself. It made crews healthier and better able to use the real cures they found. Sauerkraut appears in ships' inventories like a medicine prescribed by habit. Cook issued it regularly and credited it with preventing scurvy among his men. Barrels of preserved vegetables supplemented salted meat and dried biscuit on long stretches. When possible, Cook stopped for fresh food and encouraged trade with islanders. He stocked citrus when it was available, but he did not rely on it alone. In Tahiti, the crew ate yams, breadfruit, and fresh fish. They planted cabbage and potato gardens at friendly anchorages when time allowed. A single crate of green vegetables could ward off months of debility. Cook trained officers to recognize early signs of scurvy and act immediately. Discipline was precise, not punitive. Cook insisted that regulations be followed because lives depended on them. He kept logs showing compliance and failures and used them as evidence. A captain's authority turned into a public health instrument aboard ship. On one voyage, an officer recorded weeks without a single scurvy case. The record mattered because it proved a method could succeed at sea. Science would later explain why these measures worked. At the time, the proof was practical, repetitive, and visible in men's faces. Cook's success did not immediately change naval orthodoxy. Medical opinion still argued over causes and cures. But other captains began to copy Cook's checklists and provisioning lists. The Admiralty watched these practical results and finally adjusted policy. In 1795, the Navy issued citrus juice as a routine shipboard ration. That order arrived more than a decade after Cook's voyages demonstrated prevention. The key lesson from Cook was organisational, not chemical. He treated scurvy as a supply chain problem and a hygiene problem. He measured stocks, forced airing, and made stops for fresh food. Management, not miracle, kept men on their feet. Healthy sailors allowed naturalists to do their work without constant interruption. Joseph Banks collected specimens on the Endeavour because sailors could handle the work. Botanical collections and ethnographic observations returned to London intact. Cook's voyages became laboratories for practical preventive medicine at sea. Other captains lacked Cook's regimen and paid dearly. Entire expeditions were immobilised by roving weakness and bleeding gums. Some ships limped home with half their crews missing or dead. Cook showed a different path forward, one organised around prevention instead of cure. This chapter of history makes logistics the hero, not a single doctor or ingredient. Routines, checklists, and clean holds saved lives on a scale no potion could. Cook institutionalised prevention by tying it to command and reward. Compliance meant food, warmth, and duty fulfilled. Without sick, unfit crews, charts grew more accurate and voyages ran longer. Cook's maps of New Zealand and Australia's east coast changed European navigation forever. Those maps were possible because crews could land, climb, measure, and return. The Navy slowly absorbed Cook's methods into formal regulations. Surgeons and sea captains began to view provisions as preventive medicine. The idea seeped into the culture of seamanship throughout the late 18th century. When the Admiralty ordered citrus rations in 1795, Cook's experience had already paved the way. Modern historians call Cook's programme an early public health system at sea. It combined empirical observation, record-keeping and supply management into a coherent practice. It worked because captains accepted responsibility for crew health as a command duty. The Endeavour returned in 1771, 1779. Cook's death in Hawaii did not erase his managerial legacy. Other captains copied and improved his practices across many fleets. Prevention by design began to replace reactive experiments aboard ship. Cook's triumph helped shift thinking from isolated cures to systems of care. It made clear that behaviour, provisioning and environment shape disease as much as drugs. That shift underpins modern public health in military and civilian contexts alike. In short, James Cook turned medicine into management. He showed that order, supply and simple fermented food saved more lives than guesswork. His ships sailed with men who could stand watch, land parties and record data. Those capabilities built empires, not by force alone but by reliable manpower. Prevention kept the pens writing, the sextants working and settlements provisioned. If earlier chapters showed scurvy as a slow, inexorable thief, Cook stopped it. His answer was mundane and profound. Prevention through discipline and supply. That lesson would save lives in navies, expeditions and colonies for generations. The galley still smelled of sauerkraut when the logbooks closed. A steward's neat note had become policy across the sea. Order had triumphed where mystery had once ruled. And scurvy, once an unstoppable blot, was now manageable and usually preventable. The harbour breathes like a machine. Masts and rigging march in disciplined ranks. Warehouses squat along the quay, their walls black with salt. Cranes lift baskets stamped for the West Indies and the Cape of Good Hope. Alongside them, a narrow office keeps daybooks and victualling ledgers. Those pages do not merely record commerce. They decide whether a ship will limp home empty or return full. They decide whether an empire can stay on station. This chapter follows those minutes. It listens to the language of supply and order. The story lives in the hands that signed receipts and sent instructions. It lives in the victualling board's tallies and the Admiralty's terse commands. Medical reports entered the same ledger as barrels of salted beef. Policy and health became the same hard account. For decades, doctors had argued at the Navy's door. James Linn's experiment had given a clear remedy. But experiments changed nothing without policy to carry them. A different kind of argument was required, one that moved from the sick ward into Whitehall. Physician officers pressed their case with numbers and minutes. Gilbert Blaine became their administrative voice. He translated sickness into budgetary language. He showed losses on returns and gains on ledgers. He argued that prevention could be calculated and supplied. 1795. The Admiralty placed citrus on the official victualling list. The order was short and unadorned. It appears in the minutes like any other instruction. Its consequence was not immediate drama. Its consequence was institutional. Making an order meaningful forced logistics into motion. Supply routes had to carry citrus to every station. The victualling board arranged stores at ports, depots and colonial yards. Barbadian planters and sailors' rum became unexpected partners in prevention. Crates of lemon and lime moved into the same accounting columns as cannon shot. Those are dry words on paper. On the water they mattered enormously. Ships that left fully victualled did not need to call at every friendly port. They could stay at sea longer. They could maintain blockade lines. They could escort convoys without replacing half their crews halfway across the ocean. The strategic logic was simple and brutal. Sick ships do not hold the line. Healthy ships do. When British vessels remained seaworthy, trade continued. When trade continued, tax revenue and credit flowed to London. Those resources bought more ships and trained more sailors. The Napoleonic Wars give the clearest proof of consequence. A navy that could keep men alive for months at sea gained operational reach. Blockades around French ports became campaigns of attrition. Convoys crossed the Atlantic with fewer shipwrecked crews. British squadrons kept distant stations supplied and defended. Seaborne lines to India and China stayed open under British flags. Other navies suffered unevenly. They lacked the same network of tropical depots. They had fewer colonial suppliers to draw upon. Their logbooks recorded sick lists with different rhythms. When a fleet could not keep its crews healthy, it lost initiative. Admiralty returns make this visible on paper. Monthly returns show diminished scurvy cases after citrus adoption. Surgeons' entries shift from many men down to occasional case. The Sick and Hurt Board's reports begin to list causes like fever and wounds, not scurvy. This administrative evidence is not elegant, it is decisive. The change altered more than battle plans. Garrisons in distant colonies depended on regular relief and reinforcements. Before systematic prevention, relief convoys were unpredictable. Troops sent to the Caribbean or West Africa arrived weakened or not at all. After reliable provisioning, garrisons remained staffed and effective. Colonial administrations could plan for long terms instead of emergency evacuations. Merchant shipping felt the difference as well. Owners and insurers noted fewer transits lost to disease. Rates of desertion and mutiny fell when men felt their ship would feed them and keep them alive. The labour pool of experienced seamen stabilised. That stability mattered for both war and commerce. The Victualling Board became a strategic arm of the state. It centralised purchasing and enforced quality standards. Casks of juice, barrels of flour, crates of citrus were entered into centralised warehouses. Minutes record contracts, invoices and penalties for spoiled goods. Those dry entries show a government learning to manage human life as an operational variable. That administrative learning spilled into other institutions. The East India Company adopted similar practices for long voyages. Colonial governors received instructions for infant rations and garrison stores. Hospitals and shore surgeons began keeping better records. Public health became part of the imperial supply chain. The scale of that change is hard to overstate. An empire depends on presence as much as conquest. Presence requires ships at sea and garrisons in place. Scurvy had once forced presence to be episodic and precarious. Prevention made presence predictable and enduring. A predictable presence turned trade routes into arteries of state power. Nor was the impact merely military. When sailors survived long voyages, letters and remittances reached families at home. Wages arrived more reliably. Communities tied to the sea could plan and invest. Those social effects compounded economic ones. The advantage became a force multiplier in global negotiation. A nation that could sustain fleets worldwide could protect its merchants. It could project coercion and offer protection. It could blockade rivals and secure ports. Diplomacy increasingly relied on the credible threat and presence of ships. Yet the story stayed bureaucratic to its marrow. Success came through paper, not heroics. A clerk's ledger entry might save more lives than a single dramatic feat of arms. A victualling contract could change the outcome of a campaign. That was the real, unglamorous power of administration. By the middle of the 19th century, the bureaucratic model spread. Naval powers and merchant firms copied storage systems and provisioning schedules. Medical data found its way into planning meetings. The state learned to measure sickness and then to prevent it. Control over scurvy also reshaped imperial competition. Navies that could not match Britain's logistics fell back from global theatres. Colonial outposts lacking reliable provisioning became vulnerable to takeover. Where health was secured, imperial structures hardened. Where it was not, they remained fragile. The ledger pages from the Victualling Office read like a map. Lines drawn between depot and destination mark the true routes of power. Those routes carried men, and men carried the means of empire. Health was one more commodity counted and managed. It became as crucial as timber, iron, or gunpowder. In the end, the control of scurvy was a strategic decision. It was not merely medicine triumphing over disease. It was the state recognising that crew health was an instrument of policy. That recognition reshaped naval doctrine, colonial administration, and commercial practice. It made possible sustained global operations across decades. A simple prophylactic moved from dispensary to strategic asset. An order in an Admiralty minute paired with victualling infrastructure changed what fleets could do. Supply chains and medical records combined to extend reach. They lowered the human cost of empire. They turned presence into permanence. Look back at the quay, the crates, the ledgers, the victualling yards. They built more than a navy. They built an advantage that helped reshape the map of the world. Controlling scurvy was not just a medical victory. It was a geopolitical force multiplier. A single bell tolled across an empty frozen plain, its sound thin and final. The noise travelled over pressure ridges, across snowfields, with no human reply. Such sounds marked abandonments, where ships became islands of iron and silence. By the middle of the 19th century, navies believed they had largely conquered scurvy. Routine citrus rations, improved provisioning, and surgeon training reduced deaths on temperate sea routes. Yet the polar zones repeatedly proved those victories fragile and conditional. The ice did not care for Admiralty circulars or maritime bragging. Sir John Franklin sailed north in 1845 aboard Erebus and Terror. The ships carried 129 officers and men on that voyage. They left with canned provisions, salted meats, hard biscuit and bottled citrus rations. For 2 years no word arrived and the nation grew alarmed and mobilised. Search parties found evidence of abandonment, cairns with notes and traces of marches. The Victory Point note, recovered in 1859, recorded Franklin's death in 1847. It recorded the abandonment of ships in April 1848 and a desperate retreat. On King William Island, searchers later found skeletons and weathered relics consistent with starvation. Bones bore cut marks indicating butchery of human remains for food in some places. Modern forensic teams analysed samples and published results decades later. They reported elevated lead concentrations in bone and tissue from the sites. They also documented lesions and bone changes consistent with scurvy in many individuals. Taken together, these findings suggest overlapping causes rather than a single villain. Scurvy stripped men of strength, stamina, and the ability to work in extreme cold. Lead poisoning yields fatigue, confusion, and neurological decline, compounding already dire conditions. Hypothermia follows when bodies cannot produce heat from shivering and muscle activity. In those circumstances, small deficits become fatal fast. At sea, fresh food could be obtained during port calls and fish plentifully preserved. In polar ice, there were no friendly ports, and wildlife availability varied seasonally. Canned meat and salted provisions contained almost no vitamin C by nature. Factories concentrated citrus and heat-treated juices for safety and shelf life. Heat destroys ascorbic acid, and long storage reduces vitamin content critically. A preventive dose can be as little as 10 milligrams of vitamin C daily. Yet bottles of concentrated lemon could show nothing of that essential content. Freeze, thaw, or a heat-treated spirit had removed measurable vitamin long before use. Surgeons and captains assumed rations on manifest meant nutritional sufficiency. That assumption failed where processing and distance had altered chemistry. Medical journals from the period described the same clinical course repeatedly. Gums bled, teeth loosened, wounds failed to heal, and work performance collapsed. Surgeon logs used stoic phrases to mask the scale of human decline. The Nares expedition in 1875 suffered scurvy amid heavy sledging and poor resupply. Nares had modern ships and Admiralty backing, yet his men still fell ill. In America, the Lady Franklin Bay Scientific Party under Adolphus Greely left in 1881. They intended long-term observations and expected occasional relief, not isolation for years. Political delays and failed relief shipments left the party without promised supplies. 25 men arrived, Only 7 were alive when rescuers finally reached them in 1884. Rescue reports described scorched gums, tooth loss, and men too weak to clothe themselves. These cases proved that distance, politics, and supply failure could recreate scurvy in modern times. Industrial innovations had unintended medical consequences in polar theatres. Canning preserved calories and protein, but ignored micronutrient stability under prolonged storage. Soap factories, sugar refiners, and bottlers prioritised bulk and flavour over vitamin assays. Regulation lagged behind industry, and naval procurement became complacent with printed icons of supply. Surgeons could not test vitamin levels on deck, and paperwork was not a chemical. When ships became trapped, simple caloric intake could not offset specific micronutrient deficits. Sledging men burned 5,000 calories or more in hard marches and heavy work. High energy needs and no vitamin sources created a medical trap on the ice. Cultural arrogance also played a role in repeated polar failures. Europeans often distrusted indigenous diets, refusing raw organs and fresh meat as unseemly. Inuit knowledge of seal and caribou provisioning offered practical solutions to scurvy prevention. When explorers adopted native methods, sickness rates dropped and strength returned quickly. Roald Amundsen, having learned early lessons, favoured local diets and pragmatic techniques. Shackleton's leadership prioritised morale, flexible rations, and improvisation on crushed ice floes. Those changes proved more reliable than technological promises in polar survival. Medical science in laboratories advanced slowly toward understanding vitamin stability and deficiency, but lab results arrived decades after many tragic lessons had been learned by blood. Public outrage over lost crews led governments to re-examine polar protocols and procurement standards. Committees demanded redundant relief, longer exploration standards, and improved storage communications with shore authorities. Manufacturers slowly learned to avoid lead soldering and to mark processing dates on tins. Those reforms did not erase the dead, but they reduced repeat tragedies over time. The Franklin loss prompted one of the largest search efforts in 19th century British history. It reshaped mapping, Inuit relations, and public appetite for exploration risk. Greely's disaster provoked American congressional inquiry, funding for relief, and scrutiny of naval logistics. These institutional reckonings improved procedure, but only after bodies and headlines forced action. For the men on the ice, survival revolved around calories, vitamin sources, and sunlight management. Practical measures included seal liver, fresh kidney, and even partially raw muscle when possible. These items provided the small but crucial milligrams of vitamin C that prevented scurvy. On many voyages, the choice to hunt or to adhere to manifest determined lives. Leaders who respected local practice and prioritized nutrition saw higher survival among crews. Medical records, ship manifests, and Inuit testimony formed a mosaic of failure and rescue. Archaeology filled gaps, revealing frozen campsites, clothing layers, and scattered journals. Bones with saw marks made public the worst imprints and shocked metropolitan audiences. Those images catalysed reforms and shifted public taste for adventure stories into scrutiny. By the early 20th century, some expeditions applied lessons learned to great effect. Amundsen's teams used local diets and flexible plans to sustain long polar journeys. Shackleton's men survived the endurance ordeal thanks to leadership, improvisation, and careful nutrition management. These triumphs showed that scurvy could be managed without chemical tests on the ice. Still, the polar theatre remained a place where logistical error could outpace medical knowledge. A broken tin, a delayed relief, or bureaucratic indifference could restart old patterns of death. Each tragedy prompted institutional fixes, but grief and loss remained the original teachers. In the quiet after recovery, committees rewrote procurement rules and storage specifications. Manufacturers improved labelling, and governments phased out some dangerous soldering practices. Scientific chemistry later identified ascorbic acid and measured its fragility under heat. but those lab discoveries became useful on ships only after institutional change and practical humility. The ice, as historian records show, revealed not only missing bodies, but systemic blind spots. It taught that absence of disease on paper does not equal absence in practice. For those who survived to tell it, the memory was clinical and exacting. In cairns and logs, the language is sparse, precise, and coldly administrative. That dryness underscores the systemic failure to deliver a microscopic nutrient at microscopic doses. Even as navies controlled scurvy on long sea routes, polar ice remained where the disease could still decide life or death. Glassware clattered against a stainless steel bench. A scientist leaned forward and peered through a microscope. The lab smelled of alcohol and citrus oil. This was the sound of a long problem finally forced into the light. In 1928, Albert Szent-Györgyi isolated a substance he called hexuronic acid. He pulled it from animal adrenal glands and from bitter orange extracts. He noted unusual chemical behaviour. He suspected biological importance. He did not yet prove the link to scurvy. Across the Atlantic, Charles Glenn King worked with a different approach. King used guinea pigs because they could not make vitamin C themselves. In 1932, he extracted the anti-scorbutic factor from lemon juice. He tested it in careful feeding experiments. He showed the extract cured scurvy in animals. Then he compared its properties to Szent-Györgyi's hexuronic acid. They matched. One compound, two independent lines of work. A century-old observation had a molecular candidate. Walter Norman Haworth took the next step. He determined the molecule structure and then synthesized it in the laboratory. He named it ascorbic acid. Ascorbic. Anti-scorbutic. That name folded centuries of sailor lore into chemical language. Szent-Györgyi and Haworth shared the Nobel Prize in 1937. Recognition came quickly once the molecule's identity was clear. Recognition also reflected a new trust in biochemical proof. Ships could no longer rely only on taste and tradition. Identifying the molecule still left a larger question. What does this tiny compound do inside the body? Biochemists spent the following decades answering that question. By the mid-20th century, they mapped the mechanism. Ascorbic acid functions as a cofactor for key enzymes. It maintains iron in enzyme active sites in the reduced state. Those enzymes include prolyl and lysyl hydroxylases. They add hydroxyl groups to specific proline and lysine residues. Hydroxylation stabilizes collagen's triple helical structure. Stable collagen is the matrix that holds tissues together. Without hydroxylation, collagen is weak and frays. The clinical picture becomes plain when biochemistry is clear. Weak collagen means fragile blood vessels. Fragile vessels hemorrhage. Gums swell and bleed. Skin bruises and reopens. Wounds fail to close. Bones and joints become tender. These are the signs sailors recorded at sea. They're also the signatures of a single biochemical deficit. That clarity changed everything practical. A molecular identity enables measurement. It allows standard doses. Researchers found prevention required only small daily milligram amounts. Those amounts could be concentrated, preserved, and shipped. Industry answered. Chemists developed practical routes for large-scale production by the mid-1930s. Chemical synthesis and fermentation methods cut cost and increased supply. Mass manufacture turned a perishable remedy into a storable commodity. No longer did a ship's fate depend on fresh limes in port. Policy followed science. Navies began to issue measured vitamin C in rations. Tablets and concentrated syrups replaced unpredictable citrus supplies. During the Second World War, Britain faced a blockade of imported citrus. The government mobilised civilians to harvest rose hips across parks and hedgerows. Rose hip syrup filled the gap. Children received vitamin-rich syrup to prevent deficiency. Sailors received tablets in their sailors' packs. Logistics that once required perfect timing now required simple inventory. Public health systems also adapted. Health agencies issued recommended daily intakes. Clinicians learned to recognize scurvy as a specific nutrient deficiency. Hospitals could test and treat patients reliably. A tablet, a syrup, or an intravenous dose reversed the disease. What once killed hundreds at sea now cleared in days. The laboratory discoveries also reframed medicine's view of deficiency diseases. Scurvy joined a growing list of conditions caused by missing nutrients. This led to programs of fortification, supplementation, and education. Where food systems could be controlled, deficiency diseases declined sharply. In wealthy nations, scurvy became rare by the middle of the 20th century. That rarity, however, revealed new truths. Scurvy did not vanish worldwide overnight. It persisted among populations with poor diets. Prisons, asylums, and impoverished neighbourhoods still reported cases. Modern hospitals sometimes saw scurvy in neglected elderly patients. The science had solved the biology but not the social causes. Science continued to find broader roles for vitamin C. It acts in neurotransmitter synthesis and in numerous oxidation-reduction reactions. It performs antioxidant functions in tissues under stress. Those roles expanded research and clinical interest beyond simple prevention. But the original literal function remained the most consequential historically. The transition from hexuronic acid to a public health tool was swift by historical standards. Within a decade, researchers had chemical identity, synthesis, and effective dosing. Within 2 decades, public agencies had guidelines and supply chains. The outcome transformed seafaring, exploration, and military logistics. Long voyages no longer had to factor scurvy as a cause of mission failure. The laboratory scenes matter because they traced a chain of cause and effect. A scientist pipette led to a single molecule. A single molecule explained collagen chemistry. Collagen chemistry explained bleeding, death, and shipboard collapse. Explaining allowed measurement. Measurement enabled manufacture. Manufacture enabled policy. That change shows how a problem moves from folklore into controlled practice. Centuries of observations gave the clue. 20th century chemistry supplied the answer. Public health and logistics applied it. The result saved countless lives and untied an old limit on human mobility. Glassware still clatters in modern labs, but now the sound signals control rather than mystery. Hexuronic acid became a named medicine. Ascorbic acid became a daily ration. Science converted a peril into a predictable prevention. Scurvy passed from a hinge of history to a solved problem in nutrition. A clerk flips through a salt-stiff logbook. His finger stops at a column of names. Each entry lists age, rank, and the day they died. The deaths are not battle reports. They are quiet lines for bleeding gums and swollen limbs. They are the ledger of scurvy. Across centuries, disease killed far more sailors than cannon fire. At times, scurvy ranked among the top causes of death at sea. Entire crews could be reduced to a handful of fit men. Voyages returned with depleted ranks and broken plans. Countries measured maritime power by more than ships and guns. They measured it by how well they could keep men alive. Consider the first global circuits. 15th century caravels left ports crowded with optimism. They returned carrying new maps and fewer hands. Magellan left 500 men. Only 18 completed the circumnavigation. Scurvy and starvation did most of that killing. Those losses shaped the mapping of the world. They determined where colonies stuck and where they failed. 100 lost sailors in a single voyage changed imperial teeth. A failed supply line could end colonial dreams as surely as an ambush. The professor's ledger amplifies into a national accounting. Navies delayed campaigns because they could not feed crews properly. Admirals cancelled blockades, fearing attrition from disease. Merchants rerouted fleets to find ports with fresh provisions. Insurance premiums rose when scurvy stalked long routes. The wage of maritime commerce climbed with the risk of illness. States learned that conquest cost more than guns and treaties. It cost logistics and food and medical knowledge. The story of prevention begins with a small, stubborn experiment. James Lind, 1747. Lind put 12 sick sailors into pairs and tried different treatments. Citrus cured the men who ate it. Lind published his results in 1753. The findings solved the riddle of scurvy in a single clinic. Policy did not follow quickly. Decades passed while sailors continued to die needlessly. The world's most famous experiment proved powerless against bureaucratic inertia. This lag between discovery and implementation cost lives by the tens of thousands. It revealed a hard truth about science and power. Knowledge alone does not save people. The chain from experiment to galley is long. It requires logistics, shipping, storage, and money. It requires leaders willing to force change against tradition. It requires a bureaucracy that can translate advice into orders. When any link broke, men died. One officer who closed that chain was Captain James Cook. Cook combined science with ruthless discipline. He kept crews clean, fed, and occupied. He insisted on fresh greens when possible. He used sauerkraut and other preserved vegetables effectively. His ships suffered almost no scurvy on long voyages. Cook did not claim invention. He followed what worked. Other commanders noticed. Slowly, practice spread by imitation as much as by decree. The Admiralty finally took formal steps in the late 18th century. Lemon juice began to appear in official rations. By the end of the century, the Royal Navy distributed citrus widely. Still, logistics remained imperfect. Lemons spoiled on long passages. Concentrates sometimes arrived too late or were poorly stored. Commodities, like everything else in Empire, depended on supply lines. The nickname limey became shorthand for British sailors and their citrus rations. It also marked the point where provisioning became a national strategy. The cost of that strategy was not only measured in lives saved, it reshaped naval medicine and provisioning for the future. Medical officers became permanent fixtures aboard ships. Surgeons began to learn prevention as well as cure. Naval stores changed to include preserved foods and citrus juices. Stockpiles of vitamin-rich provisions became strategic assets. Supply chains learned to move food as carefully as they moved cannon. Those lessons travelled into civilian life and colonial administrations. Scurvy also shaped science beyond the ship's rail. The problem pushed physicians to think about diet systematically. It created demand for preservation techniques and nutritional research. Canning emerged from a need to keep food edible at sea. Food science advanced because sailors' lives depended on it. The hunt for scurvy's cause propelled experimental medicine forward. That incremental knowledge eventually led to the laboratory discovery of vitamins. Even then, proof on a table was not the same as proof on a ship. Polar and remote expeditions provided a grim coda to this story. In icy seas, fresh food was impossible for long stretches. Polar failures in the 19th and early 20th centuries still claimed men. The Franklin expedition in 1845 stands out as a tragic example. Their winter stores could not prevent collapse. Later polar parties learned to rely on preserved meats and blubber and local food. Those adaptations came late and were sometimes born from failure. There were broader economic and imperial ripple effects. Fleets that managed health better patrolled trade routes longer. Ports that could provision well prospered more than others. Companies that learned to keep crews healthy ran more profitable voyages. Scurvy influenced the shape of trade patterns and colonial reach. It mattered to whaling fleets, to merchant companies, to colonial garrisons. In many ways, scurvy helped decide where empire could stand. The human ledger always returns. Names on a roll become families without fathers. Letters home reporting death reshape small towns and distant ports. A widow's pension, when there was one, arrived late and rarely enough. Communities felt the absence of sons and brothers. Entire generations could show those absences in census tables. Those gaps altered labour markets and local demography. Scurvy's cultural imprint lasted too. Sea shanties and sailors' lore warned against long voyages without greens. Ports advertised fresh produce as much as they advertised shelter. Public health campaigns in the 19th century used the seaman's story. The idea that prevention pays became part of new medical thinking. The doctor became a planner, not only a healer. There is a rhetorical edge to the ledger. History remembers great victories and famous captains. It remembers the dates of treaties and the fall of fortresses. But the quieter account books contain a harder truth. A navy that cannot feed its men will not control the seas. An empire that cannot keep its supply lines healthy will not last. That truth forced states to invest in medicine and provisioning. It pushed them to bureaucracies that could manage complexity. Scurvy also leaves a caution for our age. A clear answer can sit unused for decades. Policy and logistics can block science as surely as ignorance can. The gap between knowing and doing can cost thousands of lives. Preventable diseases today still linger where supply or policy fail. Scurvy survives in modern pockets of poverty and neglect. Its persistence is a verdict on contemporary priorities. The ledger closes with a final count that cannot be exact. Millions of lives were touched directly and indirectly by scurvy across centuries. Hundreds of thousands of sailors died on voyages to map and trade the world. Countless colonial plans shifted because men could not be fed. The exact number will never be known. The pattern is clear. A preventable deficiency shaped global exploration, war, and commerce. If there is a single lesson from that ledger, it is institutional. Scientific discovery demands administrative muscle to matter. Mills and labs make knowledge. Supply chains and admiralty orders translate it into survival. Leadership chooses which lessons become policy. Bureaucracy maintains them over years and generations. Where any element faltered, the dead were the proof. The final entry in the clerk's book is a modest one. A name, an age, a date. Beneath it, a notation that should have been unnecessary. Cause, scurvy. That notation is a rebuke to delay and neglect. The disease that almost stopped the age of discovery became a teacher. It taught navies and nations to build systems that preserved life. It taught medical science to think about prevention first. It taught policy to respect evidence and logistics as equals. The ledger is closed, but its echoes remain. Sailors still carry the nickname. Nutrition still matters in war and peace. Policy still determines who benefits from scientific advances. Scurvy's final legacy is practical and moral. It is a demonstration that an ancient, fixable disease remade the modern world. Its defeat required not only discovery, but logistics, leadership, and stubborn institutional work. That is the cost, and that is the lesson.